What is going on, Chess YouTube? So in today's video, we're covering Praggnanandhaa's round number 10 game in the 2025 Tata Steel Chess Tournament against the Russian Grandmaster Vladimir Fedoseev. And I must say, Praggnanandhaa is my #1 favorite Indian Super Grandmaster. This game was unbelievable. Let's dive right in. All right, in the game, Praggnanandhaa opens 1 d4 and Vladimir goes d5. Then we have c4, the Queen's Gambit decline. And which line will Black go for? The main lines are d takes c4, c6, and e6. And in this game, Black does go e6. We have the good old-fashioned Queen's Gambit decline on the board, one of the most solid and respectable ways to open as Black against 1d4. Now here, Praggnanandhaa, he follows the main line, knight c3, exerting pressure on that d5 pawn. And of course now, the main lines for Black include knight f6 and bishop e7, at which point White usually trades on d5. However, Vladimir, he had a very specific idea in mind for this game, and here on move 3, he does play the move c5, heading for the famous Tarrasch opening. Now, the Tarrasch is relatively rare at the highest level these days because White can trade on d5 and get a relatively good game via many different move orders. And here, Praggnanandhaa, he does trade on d5, c takes d5, Black takes back, e takes d5, and now here, knight to f3. And now, of course, Black is going to have several different moves in this position, including c takes d4, knight c6, and knight f6, but none of those moves are fully satisfactory, and no matter what Black does here, White should be walking away with a relatively large opening advantage if he knows what he is doing. Now, the strongest move here for Black is likely knight c6, but instead, knight f6 played in the game, and the drawback of this move is White can just go bishop g5, pinning that knight on f6 to the queen on d8 immediately with the intention of following up with the move e3 with the bishop outside the pawn chain, and that is what Praggnanandhaa goes for. So bishop g5 on the board, again pinning that knight on f6 to the queen on d8. It is not going anywhere, and from here White can follow up with the move e3, for example, simply getting the bishop outside the pawn chain, then putting all those pawns on dark squares, followed by, say, bishop b2, short castles, and so on with an excellent game. Now here, Black, he knows that knight on f6 is under pressure, as is the pawn on d5. Here, White's threat is very simple. Bishop takes f6, and if queen takes, then you go knight takes d5, winning that free pawn on d5. Therefore, Vladimir goes bishop e6, bolstering the pawn on d5, and responding to the tactical threat, again, of bishop takes f6. Now, if White does that, Black recaptures with the queen, and the pawn on d5 is sufficiently defended. Now, here, Praggnanandhaa, he's got a couple of different options. There's the solid option of just e3. However, there is a more aggressive option here. That includes taking on f6, and if Black takes back with the queen, then you go e4, blowing open the center. There's a ton of tension in the center here. That is arguably the stronger and more principled line, but instead, in the game, Praggnanandhaa, keeping it safe, he goes e3, a very solid move. Very hard to argue with that move from White. And now here, Black, his main problem is that White at some point in the future could take on c5, giving Black that weak isolated pawn on the d5 square. That would be very, very good for White. Of course, Black doesn't have to wait for that. He can also go c4 as he did in the game. So here, Black goes c4, a very committal move. And now the big feature of this position is those competing pawn chains. Black has the 4 versus 3 pawn majority on the queen side. Meanwhile, White has the 4 versus 3 pawn majority on the king side, and that means both players here will be attacking on opposite sides of the board. Black on the queen side with moves like b5, a5, and b4. Meanwhile, White, I mean, he's got a lot of different ideas, but it may include knight e5, f4, g4, and so on. We'll have to wait and see how the game progresses. Now here, one option for White is just going bishop e2 and short castles, but Praggnanandhaa, he says, you know what, given the chance, I'm going to trade on f6 immediately. Bishop takes f6 plus played in the game, and now here you may think the most obvious recapture is just queen takes f6. That makes a lot of sense to me. However, Vladimir, he has different ideas in mind for this game. He does take back with the g pawn. G takes f6 chosen in the game, and this move is a little bit dubious. What is the idea? Well, technically, you are opening up the g file for the rook. You may have some some dangerous attacking ideas on the g-file in the future, but here Praggnanandhaa, he just shuts down the idea immediately with the very precise move g3, blocking the g-file in advance, and now his idea is to go bishop g2, again blunting the rook on g8, putting pressure on d5 with the bishop, and overall white's going to have a very harmonious setup here, and black's pawns on the f-file are going to be very, very weak. So what did Vladimir have in mind from here? Well, the computer says the strongest move here is just b5, immediately gaining space on the queen side and setting up very aggressive ideas. Instead, bishop b4 played in the game, immediately pinning that knight on c3 to the king on e1. But again, this move is a little bit slow. Instead, b5 or perhaps knight c6 were the stronger ideas. Now here, Praggnanandhaa, bishop g2 is the move, developing the fianchettoed bishop. Now knight c6 and short castles and short castles. So black here, surprisingly, he actually commits his king to the king side, and this may actually not be the strongest idea. After all, with the king still on e8, you still had ideas like h5, h4 later in the game. You could also go immediately queen d7, threatening bishop h3, and so on. So overall, it may have made a little bit more sense to keep the king in the center of the board, but instead here, Vladimir Fedoseev, short castles is the move. Again, a very committal option for the second player. All right, now here, Praggnanandhaa, he has a lot of different options in this position. And of course, his main idea now is not to attack on the king side, but rather to play against those weak isolated pawns on the f-file and all of these weak squares on the king side in general, especially using those two knights. So here, white has a wide variety of moves. The computer likes knight h4, knight e2, knight e1, rook e1, a3, and rook b1. And in the game, knight to e2 chosen by Praggnanandhaa, my number one favorite Indian super grandmaster. All right, now here, Vladimir, how will he respond? Of course, white's threat is to go potentially knight f4, exerting pressure on e6 and d5. Maybe he follows up knight h4 and so on, opening up the bishop scope on d5. We'll have to wait and see what happens. But here, Vladimir, how is he going to respond? He goes rook to c8, getting his rook to the semi-open c-file, and maybe even soon to be fully open c-file. Now Praggnanandhaa, knight h4, develops his knight, and of course opening up the scope of the bishop to attack d5. Of course, d5 is protected for now, but overall a decent idea. Now here, Vladimir, king to h8 is the move. The idea being you are getting the king off the open g-file, and again, the rook may come to g8 later in the game, so a decent prophylactic move by the second player. Now here, Praggnanandhaa, a3, driving back the bishop. Where is the bishop going to go? It can go to a5, d6, or e7. In the game, bishop e7 chosen, a decent square for the bishop, but overall here, as you can see, black's setup is relatively passive. He still hasn't gotten his pawns rolling down the board, and here white is just cruising. He's ready for knight f4, he's ready for queen f3 or h5 ideas, and so on, and white should be getting a very large initiative. However, here, instead of those moves, Praggnanandhaa, he knows right now is the time to strike in the center, and he finds the very, very strong, very precise move, e4, boom, immediately blowing open the center. He knows everything right now is defended. If black takes on e4, the pawn on d4 is defended sufficiently by the knight and the queen. Therefore, now is the time to strike. All right, what is black going to do in response? Of course, if you take on e4, white just takes back with the bishop. Bishop takes e4, and the bishop suddenly is very active on this diagonal, and you do control the f5 square, stopping f5 ideas. So taking on e4, it makes sense, but overall, it may not be the most attractive option for black. Instead, Vladimir here, sticking to his guns, he just goes rook g8, sliding his rook over onto the semi-open g-file here. Now Praggnanandhaa, rook to e1, developing the rook of his own onto the e-file, increasing the strength of the rook exponentially. Now black, bishop f8, retreating the bishop, but this setup here with the bishop on f8, the rook on g8, and the king on h8 is very, very committal. I mean, the king is effectively stuck on h8 for now. All of black's pieces are sort of tripping over each other, and these pieces have very little communication with the queen and the rook on the queen side. So here, Vladimir going for a very committal setup. Overall, I'm not so sure about this setup from black. All right, now Praggnanandhaa, queen to c2 is the move, getting the queen onto this diagonal here. Now, this is a very double-edged move. On the one hand, the queen is quite strong here. On the other hand, it is sitting opposite the black rook on c8. That could be very problematic later in this game, especially if black opens up the c file with a move like b5, intending perhaps, I don't know, a5, b4, and so on. So Vladimir, he knows what he is doing with that queen on c2. It is too dangerous to be kept there. Therefore, he does need to get something going on the queen side immediately. Now Praggnanandhaa, rook a d1, sliding the rook over to the square where the queen used to be occupying it. Now Vladimir, knight to e7, retreating his knight, guarding that f5 square and g6 with the knight, and beyond that, of course, removing one more piece from the c file, and now it is just the rook, the pawn, and the queen on the c file. That is getting increasingly dangerous for white. Now here Praggnanandhaa, knight c3, developing the knight and putting pressure on both d5 and b5. How is black going to respond? In the game, he goes a6, guarding that b5 pawn with his other pawn and letting white take on d5 if he wants to. But I do want to point out, in this position, it was quite critical for black to find the move bishop g4, the intermediate move, putting immediate pressure on that rook on d1. That would have been the right way forward. Instead here, a6 played in the game, bolstering that pawn on b5. But here, Praggnanandhaa, he just trades on d5, e takes d5, seizing the initiative. Here we go, and once again, the right move for black is going to be bishop g4, but once again, he ignores that move and instead goes knight takes d5, capturing towards the center. But here, Praggnanandhaa is slowly starting to take over in this game. Here he plays the strong but simple move, bishop e4, setting up pressure on this diagonal, and now, of course, bishop takes h7 is a very real threat. What is black going to do about it? Well, here Vladimir plays one of the flashiest moves of this game so far. He goes for it with the move knight to f4. Now, this move may look insane. Aren't you giving up that knight on f4? Well, it turns out that pawn on g3 is pinned to the king on g1 by the rook on g8. Therefore, g takes f4 is not even a legal move. I can't even play it if I wanted to. The computer will not let me do it. But here Praggnanandhaa, he's not slowing down. He goes bishop takes h7, winning the free pawn and hitting the rook on the g8 square. Where is that rook going to go? It goes to g5. The point being now, the rook has access to the h5 square where it would be hitting both the bishop and the knight. That could be a very dangerous setup later in this game. Now here Praggnanandhaa, he knows that bishop on h7 has to come back. It is too vulnerable. So bishop e4 is the move, and now queen d7 for Vladimir, intending bishop h3 ideas, potentially maybe even knight h3 and so on. I'll have to wait and see what he has in mind. Now Praggnanandhaa, he senses danger on the g file. He goes king to h1, and now the threat of g takes f4 is being renewed. That knight is going to have to go somewhere. Where's it going to go? Well, it turns out it's not going anywhere. Actually here, Vladimir, rook to h5 is the move. Very creative, putting pressure on that knight on the h file. The point being, if you take the knight on f4, g takes f4, that would be a little bit of a mistake, as then black can take on h4, as that knight is no longer defended by the pawn on g3, as it's now on f4 instead of g3. So instead of that, in this position, Praggnanandhaa, bishop f3 is the move, pressuring that rook on h5. And where is the rook going to go? Well, in the game, rook to h5, rook h6 is the move, retreating the rook one square. All right, from here, Praggnanandhaa has two main options in this position. The strongest move here, believe it or not, is just bishop e4, but instead Praggnanandhaa says, you know what, it is time to march forward with that d pawn. d5 is the move. The passed pawn has now entered the game. It is now a fighting piece, and of course, it is pressuring the bishop on e6. Where is that bishop going to go? In the game, Vladimir Fedoseev, bishop h3 is the move, the best square for the bishop. Now Praggnanandhaa, bishop e4, taking control of this diagonal and setting up the idea of perhaps knight f5. If I can draw arrows correctly, knight f5 on the next move. Now here, Vladimir, rook h5, again guarding f5, stopping knight f5 ideas temporarily, but Praggnanandhaa is not done. He goes knight to e2, retreating his knight and finally putting pressure on that knight on f4. Now, of course, both the pawn pawn and the knight are attacking it. Where is it going to go? In the game, knight takes e2 chosen, then queen takes e2, and then Vladimir, the very creative move, rook to e5, sliding the rook over and pinning that bishop on e4 to the queen on e2. And what is Praggnanandhaa going to do about it? Well, the strongest move here is knight f3, retreating the knight and putting more pressure on the rook. Instead, f4 chosen in the game, advancing the pawn, putting pressure on the rook. And where is the rook going to go? Well, before touching the rook, Vladimir plays the very strong, very important intermediate move, bishop g4, ignoring the rook and, of course, pressuring the queen beforehand. Now, the queen must move. The strongest placement for the queen is g2, but instead queen f1 chosen in the game. And on f1, it simply doesn't synergize with that bishop on e4 nearly as well. g2 is clearly the better square for the queen. Now here, Vladimir has the option of the insane rook sacrifice / exchange sacrifice. Rook takes e4. The computer is just begging for that idea. Instead here, rook h5 played in the game, keeping the rook alive. And this is where Praggnanandhaa really starts to take over in this game. First, he goes bishop f3, retreating his bishop. Keep in mind, he is up an entire pawn, that being the pawn on h7 that black lost earlier in the game to bishop takes h7. So now Praggnanandhaa, he knows if he can trade down into an endgame, it is going to be almost all but over. So here, bishop f3 pins the bishop on g4 to the rook on h5. That virtually forces the exchange of these bishops on f3 and g4. But before trading the bishops here, black actually goes for the move c3, trying to get counterplay on the queen side, and this is a massive mistake. Instead, the computer says the best move here is bishop h3, once again going for the intermediate move, putting pressure on the queen on f1. Instead here, of course, c3 played in the game, and Praggnanandhaa says, you know what, no problem, b takes c3, I'm gonna win that free pawn. And now what is your plan? Well, it turns out once again, Vladimir should be thinking about the move bishop h3, putting pressure on the queen on f1. Instead here, rook takes c3 played in the game, gobbling up that pawn. But here, Praggnanandhaa, as promised, he just takes over in this game. Bishop takes g4 played, then queen takes, then queen to e2, offering the queen trade. And it is almost impossible to retreat the queen and maintain the defense of the rook on h5. For example, on f5, the knight takes it. On g6, the knight takes it. I mean, where else is the queen going to go to maintain the defense of that rook? With that in mind here, queen takes e2 is virtually forced. Then we have rook takes e2, and then bishop d6, the very important move blockading that strong pawn on d5. But of course, Praggnanandhaa, he is not done. He is just getting started in this game. He goes rook to e8, hitting the king on the h8 square. And now, very importantly, for tactical reasons, king g7 is the right move, but instead king h7 chosen in the game. And it may look like a small difference, but this little move makes all the difference in this game. The king is just too far away from the center of the board now. And here Praggnanandhaa goes rook d8, pressuring the bishop on d6. Where is that bishop going to go? Well, here Vladimir, he finds the brilliant idea of bishop takes f4, the temporary piece sacrifice. Of course, the idea being if you take the bishop, then black takes the knight on h4, and black is just cruising. So you can't do that. Instead, d6 played in the game, completely ignoring the threat on the bishop on f4, which could be taken. But here, Vladimir, he gives it the bishop again. Bishop takes g3, the second bishop sacrifice. And again, Praggnanandhaa ignores it. He knows if you take on g3, then rook takes g3 is potentially devastating, as black is threatening rook takes h4. That would be checkmate on the spot. Instead, d7 chosen in the game, the strongest move, advancing the pawn. Now black goes rook takes h4. And of course, now the bishop on g3 cannot be taken, as the pawn on g2 is pinned to the king. And beyond that, black is threatening rook takes h2. So now it is an all-out race between Praggnanandhaa and his extra pawn about to promote versus the rook, bishop, and rook of black trying to checkmate the white king on h1. All right, here Praggnanandhaa finds literally the only move to win the game. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the only move right here for Praggnanandhaa in this position. This one is an absolute shocker. All right, here, the key move is rook to c8. The point being, you are threatening d8, promoting to a queen, and meanwhile, you have tension on the rook on c3. That is the key. If instead you go rook to e8, that is just too slow as there's no attack on the rook. But here, with rook c8, black has urgency. He has to respond. In the game, he goes rook takes h2, winning the pawn, then king g1, and then rook takes a3, winning the other pawn and keeping the rooks alive. But now here, Praggnanandhaa, d8 promotes to a queen. He is now officially up the queen versus the bishop. That is just way too much material advantage. Here, black goes bishop e5, trying to defending the pawn on f6, but Praggnanandhaa, he cleans up. Queen g8, hits the king. The king has to go to h6. That is the only move. And then here in the final position, Praggnanandhaa finds the move, queen to f8, hitting the king on h6 and the rook on a3. Praggnanandhaa is about to win the rook, and for that reason here, Vladimir Fedoseev, he simply resigns on the spot to Praggnanandhaa in round number 10 of the 2025 Tata Steel Chess Tournament. Wow, what a game. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please smash that like button. It helps me out so much. And go ahead and comment down below what you thought of this crazy game by Praggnanandhaa against Vladimir Fedoseev. And by the way, comment down below if Praggnanandhaa is your favorite Indian Super Grandmaster, as he is mine. I mean, I like Gukesh, but Praggnanandhaa to me is a much more flashy, aggressive player. I enjoy his games a little bit more, so Praggnanandhaa in my heart is still number one. But comment down below in terms of who you think is your favorite Indian Super Grandmaster. And if you want to see more Praggnanandhaa action, check out this video right here where I cover Praggnanandhaa's latest game against Gukesh in the 2025 Tata Steel Tournament. That game was off the hook, so check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.